of motivating people to think about climate in the here and now, with the health impact it can have on them in their day-to-day lives, as well as change in the long term. So, very exciting area to be working, and Global Action Plan have been working on clean air for many years. We were one of the first organisations in the field. And as you've just heard, we are the coordinators of Clean Air Day, and we kicked it off about 5 years ago. So quite a few years of experience in this space. So, what is Clean Air Day? So it's the biggest air pollution campaign in the UK. And what we really try and do is help increase public knowledge and drive a positive campaign. What it's all about is what we can achieve together if we all work together. And what we're really focusing on this year is two things. One is what we can all do to change our behaviour, to improve the air that we breathe, but also what we can all say, how we can lend our voice to create change. Because whether we work for an organisation or in an individual capacity, we've got a huge amount of power to make that change happen. And in particular this year, we are focusing on the importance of children's health and how children's health relates to air pollution, because so many people don't appreciate that there's an impact from the moment you're born, in fact, from when you're in the womb right through to the whole of your life. But thinking about how important it is right now to improve children's health and give them the best chance in life is what we've really been focusing on this year. And we've seen a huge amount of traction on that theme. This slide I put together ahead of today's Clean Air Day. So this was looking at what we'd achieved last year, which was obviously huge in terms of kind of the reach that we managed to achieve and the number of articles. And what's exciting to say is that this year looks even more powerful as a campaign. We achieved a first for Global Action Plan. We were on the front page of The Guardian, which we've never quite managed to get before. And we're in all sorts of broadcast coverage and national press coverage and local coverage, which is really important. It's really important that people within their communities hear this message and relate it to their world, their street, their neighbourhood, their community. So it's been a very exciting day, and still pleased to be trending #1 on Twitter, still ahead of Enid Blyton and her blue plaque, which is obviously a very strong contender for coverage. So what I wanted to talk a bit about today is how together we can work to use science to really encourage this positive behaviour change, and think about how we can make sure that we're using stats and information that comes out of science in a way that's properly persuasive for people. And quite often the kind of premise is that we need to use science to sort of worry and scare people, and that's the most powerful way it can be used. And it is incredibly powerful to prove to people, you know, the scale of the problem and the depth of the problem. No denying in the role for that, and we ourselves have done it to great effect. Our news story in previous years, 2 years ago, our Clean Air Day news story focused on the impact on the unborn baby, and we got a lot of coverage for that. And even this morning, Professor Holgate mentioned that very powerful stat that air pollution can have a 20% impact on fertility. So I mean, these stats are very powerful in terms of addressing the need. But when we come down to behaviour change, our point of view would be that we'd like to encourage all of us in this room to think about how we can tell that positive story, how we can use science to demonstrate that we can make a difference. Because part of the problem with clean air is that dirty air seems a kind of fact of life. It's something we just kind of whinge about a bit, or we've got gritty eyes and isn't it horrible when you go in the city, but we sort of think that we have to live with it, and we don't necessarily think that we can change it. So what we'd like to inspire you today on is thinking about how science can be used to demonstrate that change can happen and show people the difference that we can make, both as individuals and as organisations, and also how we can make it clear that everybody has a role to play and how we can use science to do that. So what I'll do is just give you a few examples of where we've applied science in each of these principles, and then we can come back to questions at the end of the session if you'd like to put some to us. So science can help demonstrate change at a system level, and obviously it's really important that we have this harmony between system change and personal change, so that when we make system change, we know that the fundamentals can change, but that we also know as individuals we've got to change too, and that we see the correlation between those things. But we've used science very effectively to encourage this system change. We've created these frameworks which are very powerful, that are used within institutions. In the Clean Air for Schools one, just to draw on the children's health theme for today, we've worked to create a bespoke action plan. It's got 35 potential actions in there, and we've worked with the University of Manchester on creating that plan, so that all schools now are able to draw up their own clean air framework. And there's a very strong scientific basis for that framework. And it was a great partnership with the University of Manchester to create that together. And what that does is it shows schools that they can make a difference, and that there are a series of actions that can be immediately applied within their institution. But also we can use science to encourage people that change can be made on a personal level as well, and starting to think about the how around how we talk to people, how we apply that science. And this is a great example of taking a visual approach, of using science but turning it into very simple and compelling visuals. So what we did is we had a series of images, a beautiful flowering lungs for when the air quality was good, and then some sad, decaying, dying flowers for when it was bad. And we encourage people on social media to post, to look up the data on the DEFRA data, and then use the image that corresponded to the air quality of that day. And that allowed individuals to really relate to the topic, and think about their own, the air quality in their own area and in their own personal circumstances. And then in terms of demonstrating the difference that we can be made, and telling this positive story, this was a really interesting dilemma for us this time last year for Clean Air Day, because we had this stat that showed that reducing air pollution by 20% could add a month in every learning year for children. It was a really powerful stat, but we were given lots of advice by all the kind of PR consultants telling us, oh no, you have to turn that story around, you have to tell it as a negative. The media won't respond if you tell it as positive, because the media only want to hear problems. And we just felt that the right thing to do was tell the positive story and put it out to the media in the positive. And we did, and we got an incredible amount of coverage. You saw some of those stats at the beginning. We got nearly 1,200 pieces of coverage for a positive story. And that was really encouraging to us, because it did show us that people will respond and the media will respond if we've got a really scientific, strong story. And that was another one we worked on with the University of Manchester. And then thinking about how we use science to inspire people, as the difference we could all see in what the future could look like. We've been working with lots of different collaborators, and I think many of you in the room have had a role in collaborating with this school's future vision piece. And what it is it's a great interactive piece on our website. I encourage you all to go and find it. Those little pink dots, so you can hear voices talking about that amazing experience of living with clean air and how inspiring it is and what a difference it makes. And this is a tool we're using across local authorities and schools to show us that a clean air world is possible, and how wonderful it might be if we could learn in a clean air environment. So again, using a very simple visual approach, applying science to simple visuals and telling that story. And then thinking about science in terms of encouraging this individual action piece, we've been working with Imperial on a clean air calculator. And what this does is it allows people to go in, complete a number of questions on all sorts of behaviours, and it gives them a score at the end as to how significant their contribution to air pollution is, and all the way through it gives them facts and hints as to how they can change their own behaviour. And that score at the end comes with a series of actions that they can take to reduce their particular impacts, those that have shown highest on their scoring. And this is a tool that we've upgraded with Imperial over the last few weeks, and putting back out today as part of Clean Air Day. So a very exciting way of using science to really inspire individual action and show people the difference they can make on a personal level. So as a summary, what thoughts would we share today? I guess from our point of view, it's how can we be most strategic with the outcome? How can we use science to really encourage behaviour change? We know there's lots and lots of behavioural science that shows us that encouraging people with a positive is how you get that behaviour change. And there's an amazing piece of work from Climate Outreach that really summarises and draws that to attention, and is a great piece of work if anybody wanted to follow up on that as to how we can enhance our communications. Then being mindful of our audience, thinking about how our audiences are motivated, and thinking of what tools we use, how we can be simple and visual with those tools, so that we can distill the subject down into a way that people can respond in a way that they can see and appreciate and feel. So I guess on Clean Air Day, the message is that we all need to come together to work together. Clean Air Day works with local authorities, it works with business, it works with schools, it works with health authorities, but so much of our work is done with academic institutions and scientists, and that's so incredibly powerful for us that we have that endorsement and that credibility. It's a very confusing world for people. The media landscape is very disorientating. It's very hard for people to know what to trust these days, and the role of science and academia in really giving that comfort for people and that credibility for people, it couldn't be more important. So here's a list of some of the wonderful people and organisations we've worked with. There's many of you here today who may not be on that list who work with us, and huge thanks to you too. What we'd love to do is work with all of you and any of you, so please do get in touch. Let us know any studies or anything that's in the pipeline, and we'd love to pick up on that and work together on it. So thank you very much, and enjoy Clean Air Day.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Charlotte. That was fantastic and really, really great to hear what you're doing there and how we can plug into that. I'm going to jump straight into our next speaker. So Lukasz Walasek, who's our next speaker. Lukasz is at the University of Warwick. He's an associate professor in the Department of Psychology. He's a behavioural scientist who's studying various aspects of human judgment and decision-making process. He's going to talk today about how we turn communications into action and the insights from behavioural science. And he's going to introduce some of the key principles of behaviour change and how we can communicate these to the public and children to work to give us effective and actionable interventions in the context of air pollution. So over to you, Lukasz.
Thank you very much. Let me see. Okay, I assume everything is visible.
Yep, we can see that. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much for this introduction, and also thank you for organizing this talk in such a way that I will come second, because a lot of what I will be talking about is in fact directly following up on the subject of how can we use insights from, well, in this case, behavioral science, to design better ways of communicating risks when it comes to air pollution and people's exposure to it, and how can we encourage through that information action both at the level of organizations and individuals. Okay, so now I will make an educated guess that a lot of people in the audience are not behavioral scientists or experimental psychologists like myself. So I'll start with some brief introductions and definitions, just going to put things into context. So as a behavioral scientist, I'm interested in the ways in which we can use sort of the fundamental or the core principles of cognitive as well as affective science to understand how people make decisions as well as judgments in naturalistic contexts. Now, this is quite a mouthful, but really what it boils down to is the types of questions in which you try to learn something from the way in which people's memory might work, or a way in which people's attention is allocated, or how people solve complex reasoning problems, to typical decisions that we face in everyday life. Now, these decisions might correspond to which consumer good to pick in a shop, which risky asset I will invest my savings into, or perhaps am I going to take some course of action that will prevent negative consequences for my health and well-being? Am I going to take up exercise? Am I going to do something about the maintenance of my cooking devices to make sure that the air quality inside my house is better? And the direct applications of the insights from this research feed into obviously more applied side of work, which has to do with behavioral change, which is about trying to design better interventions for improving specifically the decisions that people make, often under conditions of risk and uncertainty. Now, one word, sort of term that probably many of you have come across is nudging, and nudging is sort of, corresponds to these direct applications of behavioral science when it comes to designing aspects of the choice architecture without changing incentives or limiting options that are available to the participants or individuals. We basically try to generate some positive behavioral change using the simple, cheap, often easy to administer types of interventions. Now, of course, nudging is not all there is with respect to behavioral change. It's a much broader and rich field. Nonetheless, when we talk about behavioral science, that's what we typically, I suppose, I would refer to. Nonetheless, for today's purposes, we're not talking about the interventions per se, but rather about the ways in which we can take these principles of behavioral science to design more effective risk communication strategies by learning something about the ways in which people construct their perceptions of risk that has to do with the quality of air around them. So let's start with a brief test of our intuitions. Now, I'm not going to call anyone out. This is just purely for illustration. So if, imagine that, well, these are the real some, at least, causes of mortality in the UK. Now, this is based on the data from 2010 ONS repository. And obviously, these are just in the UK. So the question to you is, thinking about these causes, how many people or what percentage of the population do you think died because of these causes? So, in other words, perhaps what is the probability that any of us would die because of these causes? Now we have things like circulatory diseases, some falls perhaps, cancers, respiratory diseases, swine flu, relevant at the time, transport incidents, and diabetes. Now, many of us here obviously are, I'm sure, experts and can give pretty accurate estimates, even for this historical data. However, if we ask the general population to give these estimates, we find that, well, people tend to give numbers that are quite far from the truth. Now, not only people are inaccurate, they are also systematically biased. So what we generally tend to find is that people underestimate risks to do with this sort of common and very prevalent causes of death, like circulatory diseases, respiratory diseases, all kinds of cancer. When it comes to these sort of rare or more kind of strange types of deaths, like, for example, falls, or things like terrorist attacks or rare outbreaks of diseases, obviously with an exception to the current times, we find that people tend to overestimate these causes of death. And from the research on risk perception, risk communication from behavioral science, we can make sense of these kind of biases by adhering to understanding how people, both in terms of cognition, the way we think about risks, and how they feel about them, how they generate these predictions. So what we find is that when it comes to very common diseases, people often find them less vivid and less easy to imagine, and this form of low availability leads to lower predictions of riskiness or probability that something will happen. They're not generally rated as particularly dreadful or fearful. They don't evoke feelings of sort of, well, being scared and anxious about these causes. On the other hand, things like falls and swine flu, obviously they are often quite available. They feature in the media. They evoke strong feelings of fear, and therefore they tend to be overestimated. Now, transport incidents is an interesting case because when it comes to your individual risk as a driver, people tend to underestimate because they believe they're better than average driver. At least more than 50% people tend to believe that. However, when it comes to your beliefs about other people in the general population, then people overestimate the risk than anyone else would in fact be involved in a fatal, say, car accident. So these examples and many others that exist are illustrations of something that kind of underpins a lot of human risk perception. So in behavioral science, we tend to, on studying judgment decision-making, make a distinction between risk attitudes, which are about our general propensity or preferences to take risks, and risk perception, which is how we as individuals subjectively and create these idiosyncratic perceptions of what is hazardous, what's beneficial, scary, controllable, and benign. And there are many cases where we find that people hold quite irrational beliefs. For example, people might be really scared of flying, even though driving would be safer. On the other hand, we might be very willing to take risks when it comes to our financial assets, but be very aversive to recreational risks. For example, taking ski jumping and so on. So ignoring the true objective probability of harm and death. Okay, and why is this all important? Is because, of course, when we think about air pollution, we're thinking about the ways in which we can communicate more effectively risks that exist out there. What's the probability that something bad will happen? How big of an issue it is that we're dealing with the poor air quality, both indoors and outdoors. And of course, over time, you see that there is certain level of media coverage. We have this great Clean Air Day now, which clearly leads to an uptake. And I mean, as Charlotte mentioned before, it's something that is visible on Twitter, which is great. More people will be talking about it, more people become aware of it. Now, at the same time, we have to be aware of the risk of the fact that media tends to amplify perceived riskiness. And that's because, again, what was mentioned about the types of headlines and both the sort of way in which information is presented in terms of its sort of structure. So, for example, are we talking about gains, positive things, or losses, the negative ones? Or, in what other way we might be incorporating affective information into our communication. I'm going to quickly skip through this. So let me talk briefly just about emotions. Now, one of the important things about risk perception literature is the sort of realization that when we think about how people construct this sort of idiosyncratic subjective perception whether something is risky or not, they often formulate strong emotional association with different sources of risk as well as different benefits. And from a perspective of, say, researchers or policymakers, we might think that, well, it's great to be able to communicate this using strong emotional discourse and imaging, and messaging how big of an issue clean air is, right? And what are what the severity of consequences of not dealing with it right now is. However, there are some ways in which this type of communication may backfire. One good example, I think, is something I've been doing quite a lot of research on called psychic numbing, which you find that people tend to be very responsive to sort of affect-rich piece of information. So, for example, when we present a case like with the Ehlers law of a single individual being affected, of course, by the bad quality of air, people's compassionate response is very strong. But when the information is so affect-rich, people become insensitive to the magnitude of, let's say, suffering or scale of the problem. And this is, of course, problematic if we think about public policy, because what you find is that, things that are causing more harm or somehow presenting statistical information about the magnitude of that harm is unlikely to change how people feel about it. They will just sort of maintain that as some kind of a baseline. And just to give you another example, I assume I still have the time, I would like to just use an example of one of my favorite studies from my colleagues at UCL, which has nothing to do with air pollution, but I think it nicely illustrates the sort of very strong principles in which our predictions about intuitions about the way in which we communicate information about risk might in fact backfire. So imagine a simple study in which I present participants with grids such as the one below, and I tell you that these black and white dots represent apple trees. If you pick a black apple, there'll be a negative outcome. And in the between subject manipulation, participants are told that you will either have that apple and maybe it's bitter, it's not particularly tasty. Other group of participants are told that this apple is actually poisonous and might lead to death. Everything else remains the same. White apple, is fine. So now in the study, you ask participants, what is the chance that a person would pick one of the black apples? And what you do in individual trials, you just vary the proportions of black to white apples. Now, from a rational perspective, we should expect that none of this matters. The severity of the outcome has nothing to do with the probability that this will happen. But actually what we find, what Harris and colleagues have found, is that while people respond to the overall probabilities with which they're likely to pick a black apple, the kind of event that it leads to has a huge effect on the mean probability estimates. In other words, people who are faced with the information that the black apple will lead to a very negative and scary event like death, they overestimate the probability that in fact a random person would pick at random a black apple. And I think this nicely illustrates the fact that, just kind of trying to feed into this sort of fear and maybe severity of the outcomes has a potential in being kind of perceived as a kind of successful way of communicating risk if you want to elicit response or some form of behavioral change. However, I mean, as scientists, I suppose, and policymakers, we have this obligation to also make sure that we, in our risk communication, we are calibrated and we make sure that we don't lead to a situation when people overestimate or underestimate the true probabilities and the true scale of the problem that we're facing. Okay, so just to finish off, I briefly wanted to bring it back a little bit more to air pollution and say that, in fact, there's still huge scope for research that could be done about the ways in which behavioral science could inform risk communication, risk perception in this domain. I mean, there are quite a few studies. So this is a table from a meta-analysis and systematic review looking at different studies in which you correlate people's perception of risk, risk or air pollution with an actual objective measures of air pollution in people's neighborhoods or areas. And overall, if across a range of different measures, so like awareness and fear and trust, annoyance, and so on, you find that there is in fact a positive correlation. So people are sensitive to the fact that perhaps air pollution around them is higher. This might come from the smoke to sensory perceptions, maybe something to do with the media, maybe the fact that they live next to a big factory. So this is sort of promising, but at the same time, if you look at other studies, we find slightly more worrying conclusions, which is that, for example, people are very inaccurate when it comes to understanding what is the source of air pollution around them. In this study by Mayon et al. From 2020, over 16,000 participants across different countries indicated what are the two main sources of air pollution. And not only people were quite inaccurate in that they mostly attributed to the industry and traffic instead of, for example, agriculture, they hugely underestimated the fact that the households are a great source of air pollution as well. And finally, sometimes we might think that we achieve something because people self-report that they are really concerned with air pollution. And like it was mentioned in the presentation below, it is true, people do recognize this as a problem. But is it going to lead to behavioral change? Well, it depends what underpins that perception. So here is an example of a study done with residents of Guildford in 2000, when the authors asked participants about, what do you think is the level of traffic-caused pollution? And what they found is that when they explicitly asked people in this way, of course, people said, yeah, pollution is a huge problem. We agree. We think it's outrageous how bad it is in our region. But the reality was that the pollution wasn't so bad, at least relatively speaking, in comparison with other regions. What is particularly more worrying about these results is that participants were more likely to say that there is a pollution problem if they had lower level of trust in the local government, right? So something completely unrelated, how I think the government makes decisions about any other unrelated issue leads to sort of my outrage type of responding when I sort of almost agree with you that yes, air pollution is bad, and probably I can blame the government for that as well. So these are, of course, just some examples of the research that has been done, which illustrate just how much more needs to be done to understand how people formulate these perceptions of risks associated with air pollution. That's all I had. I hope I didn't go over too much. Thank you for this opportunity, and I would like to say that, yeah, I look forward to your questions and comments.
Many thanks for that, Lukasz, and it's really interesting. I think you've got us all thinking about where our biases lie in our research now. I'm going to move straight on to our final speaker of today, and then we'll do our Q&A at the end. So our third speaker, I'm delighted to welcome Mike Morrison, who is joined us from Michigan State University. I suspect it's probably quite early in the day there for you. So thank you for getting up and joining us for today. We really appreciate it. Mike is a former user experience designer. He's now a PhD student in work psychology, and he's using his design and psychology backgrounds to start redesigning some of the more cumbersome and slow systems we have for distributing knowledge among scientists and beyond. He's going to talk to us today about creating bite-sized social media posters for science. So Mike, if you'd like to share your screen and kick off, please.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me. All right. Are we good? Everybody hear me? See my screen?
Yep,
Cool.
We can hear you and see you.
Awesome. Well, hey guys, I'm Mike. So what I'm going to teach you today is some general design principles backed by research that you can apply to anything you design for human beings to use. So I don't specialize in clean air research. I specialize in design research and work psychology. But this is right in line with what you just heard from Charlotte and Lukasz. They actually went even further. Hopefully, this will give you the basics, and you can create all kinds of trouble with these principles. So user experience design is what you're going to be learning. It's not like graphic design. Graphic design kind of takes it takes years to learn and a lifetime to master. I can teach you user experience design in about 2 seconds. Basically, you just have to embrace that people are lazy, and you just got to design for your inner lazy person, which all of you are probably secretly good at if you don't want to admit to it or not, right? In UX, if we think about laziness as being like an evolved advantage, if you think about what laziness is, it's really just getting the maximum possible reward for the least possible effort. That's efficient. So in UX, calling a design lazy is a massive compliment, which is really uncomfortable for scientists a lot. But really, that's the goal, is to make things very easy to process, very high reward, low effort. So I'm going to start by teaching you the most important theory in all UX design in the first 5 minutes. So if you space out during the rest of my talk, you'll have taken away the most important part. What I'd like everybody to do, if you're game to participate, is pull out your phone. So I'm going to pull out my cell phone and cast it to the screen. And I want you to open on your phone the website you'd use to distract yourself if you were already bored of me talking. So like Reddit, Twitter, Instagram, pull that up on your phone. Rick, I can see your camera. You're not using your phone yet. Go for it. You can watch my screen. You don't have to play along, but sorry to call you out, Rick. I can see your camera. I can see your camera, so I tried it. But if you don't want to pull out your phone, you can follow along with mine totally. I'm going to pull up my real Twitter account. Full disclaimer, I'm a psychology student, so I follow a lot of diverse brains. No idea what's going to show up on here. But what I want you to do is just pull out Twitter, Instagram, Reddit, and just start scrolling. Start trying to distract yourself like you normally would. Keep scrolling. I'm going to kind of narrate your behaviors like a guided meditation. So what you're doing right now when you're scrolling through Twitter or scrolling through Instagram or Reddit or New York Times if you're fancy, is you're using the same parts of your brain that you used to use when you were a cave person to forage for food, but you're foraging for information. You can think of each tweet or each post or each news article as like a patch or a bush that can contain information. And you'll notice that like sometimes you scroll past things, sometimes you like slow down and look at them. And there's kind of a couple factors that determine when you scroll past something or when you slow down and look at it. And one of those factors is interaction cost. It's how easy it is to process. So because you're trying to listen to me talk right now and do this at the same time, your cognitive resources are kind of limited. And so you're probably gravitating towards things that are really easy to process, like images, short text, that kind of thing. If I were to shut up for a second and give you more like sort of bandwidth to process things, or if you're like in a waiting room, you'd probably be able to read longer posts and things like that. So that's one factor, is how easy something is to process. You gravitate towards the easy things. The other factor though is like what you're interested in, right? And this is different for everybody, but it can change like in the moment. So try this. Try looking for something to make you happy, to make you laugh. You'll find that you're, scrolling past news articles, you're going to focus on like smiling faces, memes, clips from TV shows, right? Now change your goal. Try to find something that's informative, that teaches you something. Now you're looking at the longer posts, the things that sort of smell like science or learning, right? You'll scroll past the memes and focus on the news articles. So these kind of cues that each post is giving off that are relevant to your goal are called information sent. And what you're really looking for is something that is more interesting than it is effort, that meets your current goal and isn't very difficult to process. And that's what's going to determine whether you slow down or whether you patch switch and go past something. Okay, so phones down. Goodbye to those of you who we lost. Some of you are going to stay on Reddit. That's cool. There's always some collateral damage to that demo. So what you just learned is called information foraging theory. Information foraging theory is the bedrock of every website you've ever used, every app you've ever used. Most professional UX designers are designing based on information foraging theory, whether they know it or not. So you now kind of know more of the scientific theory behind user experience design than a lot of professional UX designers, which I think is kind of cool. To recap the concept, we had interaction cost. Interaction cost is how easy or difficult something is to use. So fast food, very low interaction cost. Going to the grocery store, following a menu, remembering that you have to be healthy, guilting yourself for being too overweight or whatever, because you let yourself go during the pandemic, as we all did. That's even that emotion, that like all of that is interaction cost. It all counts, right? So information sent was the other variable. At a very low information sent, things are very vague. So if you think about what someone's goal is when they're browsing research and things like that, their goal is to learn, right? So the information sent is going to come from how much that thing teaches you something. Scientific articles, a lot of times, are pretty low information sent. So this is a typical scientific article, like investigating the effectiveness of differential math usage strategies. These are going to be 3 titles for the same article. That's a typical scientific title, super vague, right? You're kind of like, okay, I kind of get what they're doing, right? The next level, dialing it up a little bit in the information sense, would be something like this, right? Like, worried your cloth mask isn't filtering out coronavirus? This hat could make it more effective. This sounds like clickbait, right? And that's what clickbait is. Clickbait is just a medium information sense that gives you kind of a whiff to get you to click to get more, right? The strongest information set you can provide is to literally provide insight, right? So put a nylon stocking over your cloth mask to make it more effective at filtering out coronavirus. That literally is a hit of information. And really a lot of this UX stuff comes down to rate of return. So you're trying to give people a very high return on their investment of attention, right? If you can prove to somebody that you can teach them something in half a second, they're gonna be like, what do you got in 2 seconds, right? And then the second that rate of return slows down, they'll bail. You can also do information sent with images. So a very weak information sent image for this article might be something like this. You're like, is it crowd? Is it masks? Is it people? I don't know what this is about. A very medium information sent would be like, okay, I know this is definitely about masks. All right. And the strong information sent image would be literally cloth stocking over nylon mask. Or nylon stocking over cloth mask, right? Like really, really concrete, really, really unique. Incidentally, like what Charlotte was saying about keeping things positive and what Lukasz was saying about really communicating the magnitude correctly in a way that doesn't numb people, those take this, that's even better than what I'm saying. And so like this is sort of the foundation, sort of like you got at least you get some people with some information. I think what Lukasz and Charlotte were saying would take this to the next level and make it even better. So it's all right in line. I really loved those presentations. So what you're trying to do when you're balancing, you're really trying to create a balance between information sent and interaction costs when you're designing things. So you can have something that's very like low interaction cost, low information sent. And if you've ever come across videos or something that's like, it's a 30-second video on something you're like kind of interested in, you'll click it because it's 30 seconds, who cares, right? It's low interaction cost. And you've all probably had the experience of something that's really high interaction cost, but really strong information sent, right? Like you've ever stumbled across an article where there's like pop-ups and paywalls and you got to register first, but like you really, really want to read this article, right? Like, and you'll go through all these hoops. You'll like register for a fake account, view it through incognito mode, or like in my case, I'll like, view the HTML of the website and delete the pop-up, right? Because you're so like entranced by this article's title, it's like speaking to your soul and it's so relevant to you, right? Or just any scientific article you've ever browsed is the situation, right? It's like it's so interesting to you and such a hard like effort to get to it, but you'll jump through those hoops. That's when information sent is strong enough to overcome a high interaction cost. But the best case scenario is to have a very, very low interaction cost and a very strong information sent. So it's really, really valuable and basically no effort to interact with, right? That's really the holy grail. And if you have that situation, you will get interaction, pretty much. So this is also especially important online. So the number one finding about how people read online is that they don't. They skim and they scan and they bounce around. They read half of all content barely. And when they do read, people read 20% slower on screens. It's more effort to read online. I haven't seen an explanation of this yet. I think it's something along the lines of screen resolution. So maybe, when we get to 16K or 42K, this will improve. But for now, it's slower to read online. And that means you have to keep your content much more brief, right? And less text heavy because it's effortful. And if you trigger too much of that effort, that is interaction cost, right? And then you'll get the back button. So here is one concept. So one of the challenges I've had, especially with communicating to scientists or to a mixed group of scientists and non-scientists, is that people are distracted online. No news there, right? They're browsing sites like, if they're a scientist, they're Google Scholar. If they're members of the public, it's Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, news sites. And if they're a scientist, they're browsing those things too. Scientists are human beings, so they'll browse the same websites as everybody else, right? Everybody's on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, news sites, Reddit, some combination of those, right? And the trick is that instead of trying to make people come to you, the best case scenario to get them to pay attention to your content is to bring it to them, put it where they're already looking. That's big in UX. If you've ever seen desire paths in the park where people like walked off the trail, the UX design approach would be to pave that part where they walk off, right? You just want to figure out where people are going and put the content right in front of them where they already are. So one concept I've started creating for this is, some of you have seen a Twitter poster maybe, but this is sort of a cross-platform research poster. So the idea is this is something that anybody can create. So you create a 4 to 5 slide PowerPoint presentation and you link it to more content, right? We've had whole groups of people ranging from students to professionals do this really well. Here's basically what it looks like. So you create a few slide PowerPoint presentation that's square. Square is a common format across most social media platforms that works really well. So here I've got a neuroscience poster that I'm trying to communicate. It's about 1 minute of total content. Everything is very clear and brief. So you have acetylcholine release in the BLAs just earlier as animals learn about actions and cues that lead to reward. Boom, take away in the first slide, right? And you have a little bit of information like teaching the finding. It steps them through it like one sort of step at a time. It communicates the methods visually. Even things like charts, it takes them through it one step at a time. Like in mice with more training, expert mouse, ACH spikes on the tone of the poke. And here's the tone and it's poked, you can see the little spikes, right? In mice with less training, and it points it out one at a time. And so the takeaway links to more. That's not the cool thing about this. This is, you can see how hopefully like anybody can create this kind of thing. But the cool part is that, and that is part of the cool part, but the other cool part is that this square format, this 1 square PowerPoint file, you can take and you can export to lots of platforms without any kind of technical knowledge. Like you don't need a media team to do it. Everybody can kind of do it on their own. So what you can do, just give me a second. I just lost my place. Is you can take this and you can export it to different locations. So in PowerPoint, you can export to a PDF file and you can attach a paper to it and you can get it on Google Scholar if you want to reach researchers by uploading it to Figshare. That's not a big deal. So anytime if you have a PDF of a paper or something that you're going to get published and you're not already doing preprints and things like that, remember posters count as scientific content too. So if you have scientific information on your paper that you intend to sort of publish or that you're publishing in a scientific context, you can put it on Figshare to reach researchers in Google Scholar. That's just a PDF export. What you can also do is you can save this as a video. So, in PowerPoint, you can hit record slideshow and you can add your face to the corner, talk over it a little bit. This is a picture of Rick Krause who did this study. And you have a video version just by hitting record slideshow and putting it on YouTube, right? But then in PowerPoint, you can also export to images. So if you've ever gone to File, Export Slides as Images, you can spit out each of these slides as an individual image. And then you can put that on Instagram and it works like a flip book. So people can sort of swipe through the slides, right? Then for Twitter, you can, in PowerPoint again, same file, you can export it to an animated GIF. And then you have something like this. So these are actual Twitter posters. If you go on Twitter right now and you look under the hashtag Twitter poster, you can see whole conferences of these where scientists have created themselves. They're basically just animated GIFs. They're like 5 seconds per slide. Again, my favorite part is that everybody can create these. So it's pretty easy for somebody without design training to sort of use what they know about presentation slides to put together a little mini presentation. Then the better ones of these will kind of keep it light, really follow a lot of the tips that Charlotte and Lukasz are talking about. They'll keep it light, they'll communicate in statements, positive, and communicating magnitude well is even better. But a lot of negative space is better than less. So the number one thing I see people doing that cripples these is trying to cram them up. This is especially a difficult impulse for scientists to overcome, because scientists are sort of trained to fill in every detail and make things feel very like dense, which is the opposite of what you want online, because that, you know, that negative space, the small amount of content per screen, it makes things feel easier to process, which lowers that perceived interaction cost. So I can go on Twitter here, and I can show you, if you just, again, look at the hashtag Twitter poster, you can see where scientists have posted these. And they really range a lot. You'll see some common themes. Sometimes people spit them out to video if they want more time. We've had a lot of these just go completely viral. We've had one group created, it was a psychology department, they created Twitter posters for all their research and put it under a common hashtag, and that hashtag went viral in like Ireland. It was amazing. So there's some examples. Another example, if you want some references, one of my favorite Reddits to look at is, this is the concept, is you do one PowerPoint file that can go across platform. So it's very like high return for your investment. But what I was saying is on Reddit, there's a subreddit called Cool Guides, which are basically like single screen mini infographics, right? That are really like high return. So these are really small, and you could get a lot out of them from a quick glance, and they'd work on mobile. I think this is a great Reddit to look at it for inspiration of how to communicate like a lot in a small amount of space. So you can try this, you can try the cross-platform poster, but really just the more important thing is to apply these principles of strong information sent, low interaction cost. And in thinking about when you put information out, that you're putting it into a foraging environment for people, where people are going to be like perusing lots of information and trying to respond to what's easy to process and what's interesting, and thinking about those variables when you design stuff. And that's it. If you want to learn more, I've got 3 videos on YouTube right now. One is the Better Poster Part 1 cartoon. This is the cartoon that went viral a couple of years ago in science about communicating research differently through scientific posters at conferences. Better Poster Part 2 is probably, if I were going to pick one for you to watch, if you wanted to learn more, it'd be that one. Part 2, Better Poster Part 2 goes into a lot more of the theory and research, kind of what you've already learned, plus a lot. All of these are illustrated cartoons. They should be pretty entertaining, hopefully, and informative. And then there's Twitter Poster, which focuses on communicating research on Twitter through those animated GIFs. Thanks very much. I'll turn it
Brilliant,
back.
thanks, Mike. Really interesting that, and I've just learned something there about how to do how to put slides on social media. If you could drop your screen share off, we'll get all the speakers back up. We've only got a few minutes left, but we can just ask if anybody has questions. We've got time to just take a few questions. I have got a couple in the chat already. So question which it was initially to Charlotte, but I think actually is possibly to all of the speakers. How do we confer uncertainty in the data to the general public, both modelled and measured, while still maintaining some public confidence? Charlotte, would you like to say something about that?
Yes, it's a very good question. And I mean, thinking about it from a media perspective, it's difficult because sometimes we avoid complexity because I think we're nervous that we'll lose control of the story with the media. So we tend to err on the side of sort of simplicity. Partly, I think, for a lot of the reasons Mike's been talking about, is that that's easier anyway for people. It's easier for people to receive simple information than sharing complexities. That's very challenging. We do it sometimes, and I dropped a note in the chat. I think along the lines of it's a more nuanced conversation with individual journalists to take them on board with you, so that rather than sort of sending out a press release or something, which we might do as standard, you know, we might talk to one journalist, you know, really have an in-depth understanding of the problem and ensure that when they then share that all of the complexities, dilemmas, etc. that they'll do it with a full understanding. I think, you know, I proceed with caution, I guess, in terms of sharing that complexity. I think it's difficult for people. It's a very complex area. I think probably our job is to resolve that a little and try and make it simpler for people, and get to grips with that uncertainty ourselves as communicators. I don't know whether that's a challenge or whether we'd agree with that, but people will switch off, I think, unless we do it very carefully and in a very nuanced way.
Great, thanks, Charlotte. Was there any others like to comment on uncertainty at all? Or
it's a huge challenge. It's a question I get a lot too. I will say the internet has a natural immune system to where, like, if you overclaim, sometimes they'll catch it on like Reddit or Science. But I think, yeah, everything Charlotte said I agree with. And also I think a lot of times it comes down to writing. Really experienced professors and researchers a lot of times will be able to bake in the limitations to a compelling headline, but it's really hard to do.
Great, thank you. I've got a question from Peter Fleming to Lukasz. Is behaviour change more successful if we appeal to altruism, as in you should do this to save strangers' lives, or self-interest, as in taking a train will be more convenient or save you money? Any thoughts on that?
I think that's a very interesting question. One thing we find in sort of experimental setting in economic games, especially, that's very surprising, especially when we do those studies on the kind of with population. So let's say with students, is that people are surprisingly altruistic and willing to donate, and they're very generous towards strangers. So that's definitely, there's a potential there to, and there's lots of nudges that exist to try to kind of take that advantage of it to encourage people to help with all sorts of causes. But I would say here the opportunity is to do sort of a combination of the two, because you know, sort of clean air is a public good. You know, it's sort of, it matters that I care about it for me, and it matters for other people and for the future generations. So one of the most powerful ways of communicating information and encouraging people to change their behaviors by telling them about the social norms. So informing people about what other people do and how they feel about a particular issue. Through that relative comparison, people often will change their own behavior in response, because people tend to not want to be socially extreme, do what other people do. And they also, you know, see social norms as some kind of way of communicating what's right, what's appropriate, what's good for all of us. So maybe that's one angle.
Okay, thanks, Lukasz. There's a question for Mike in the chat as well, which are people more likely to view a YouTube video or listen to a podcast? And I guess, does that depend on who?
It depends on who, but both. I hit them both. Like, to figure out ways to just sort of get your coverage, I think. I would say YouTube video. I think you're dealing with a larger like set of eyeballs there total.
Great, thank you. And actually, I've got a question to I guess to other speakers. I mean, the past 15 months or so, I think we've seen more science in the media than I think we've probably ever seen before, and people have engaged with it in a whole raft of ways. Some of it very positive, also very negative. And I wondered whether, and actually, I think it's also raised a flag about certainly indoor environments. And I wondered whether any of the speakers thought that there's, you know, how we should be doing things changed almost in the past 15 months. Is there any shift? If anyone's brave enough to comment on that.
Well, I do think we're in an era where scientists have suddenly become, you know, the go-to media figures in a way that they never have been before. Whether or not we want to play on that is another matter. But I think now, if you ask the public to name a few scientists, they probably could for the first time ever. So if scientists are the new influencers, then how do we use that for positive good, and beware of the pitfalls, I guess, of stepping into spaces where we are a little bit more in the public eye? But it feels like an opportunity to the community.
Great.
Well, that is so hopeful. Like, yeah, we are, like, people can name scientists now, and I'd love to just sort of take that even further. Like, what is the, I think, even off the point about like communicating things with complexity, like one of the things I love about these like Twitter posters and social media posters for scientists is that the scientists themselves are creating them, right? So there's already like sort of a built-in higher level of expertise versus like straight translated. And I think I'd love to see a world where that trend continues and people can recognize more scientists and things.
Okay, I think we are out of time, so we're going to have to wrap up. But I'd like to say a huge thank you to all three of our speakers. It's been fascinating and really quite different to some of what I've normally often thought about before. So I mean, I've got some good ideas, and I'm just looking at the chat. I think quite a few other people have got some good ideas as well, and real thinking about how we communicate some of this stuff to different audiences. So thank you very much for giving up your time to talk today. For everybody else, enjoy the rest of Clean Air Day, get yourself on social media and share your clean air stories to the world. Yes, thank you all for joining.